speaker. I'm sure this is going to be another, what do you call it, a new perspective as well. All right, a sharing session from Dr. Lee Kok Yueh from University Technology Brunei. So Dr. Lee, she's going to share with us on adapting to pedagogical change, a staff and student perspective. How are you, Dr. Lee? Okay, you might want to unmute. That's great. Okay.
Hi. Thank you. I'm all right. How are you doing?
Oh, good. Doing good. All right. To you, Dr. Lee.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you, UCYP and SED for having me today and for speaking as well. It's an honor to be here for the second time. My title of presentation or my talk will be on the adapting to pedagogical change from a student's perspective. Let me see if this works. Sorry about that. Okay, this talk will outline the implementation of various pedagogical approaches that within the higher education institution in Brunei, specifically UTB, University Technology Brunei, over the last decade and their impact on students' experience in terms of their learning. Okay, the outline of my presentation or my talk today will include the teaching and learning in UTB, adapting to the change, some of the major findings from the research that we have done, as well as a brief summary or conclusion. So basically, the teaching and learning in UTB, just a bit of background. It's purely on based on outcome-based teaching and learning. So before COVID time, all the teaching and learning activity in the university is done purely face-to-face. There are very limited use of learning management system at all back in the old days. And starting March 2020, that's when Brunei was hit with the first wave of COVID, and all teaching and learning activities in higher education eventually shifted to online. Schools across all levels were closed, and it's a good thing that in August 2022, everything is back to normal, although there are still some hybrid or even online learning taking place in the university. So taking advantage of a range of technologies and teaching methodologies, the projects that we have undertaken in UTB include the use of self and peer assessments, use of rubrics in assessment, even the use of Google Docs as an online collaborative platform for a report writing class, flipped classroom, as well as the shift to online teaching and learning back then when COVID strikes. First thing first, I'll just be sharing all the major findings obtained from the research that we've done, given the time that I have. So first thing first, we did a session on self and peer assessment. Okay, this was conducted to a second year engineering degree program in petroleum and chemical engineering, where we did a student self and peer assessment, and then we correlated whether there are any significant correlation with the lecturer's marks and their experiences in terms of using the rubrics as well when they have to mark their peers' reports. So some of the major findings include that students have a tendency to mark themselves more highly in self-assessment, and the findings show that the weaker students tend to sort of overestimate their own ability in comparison to the higher ability students. Okay, this is just based on performance based on their previous achievement in their exams. Okay, the results also indicate that higher scoring students were given lower marks by peers in the study. So when compared to marks given to lower scoring students, there's a tendency, the results show that the students are more likely to base their perception on students' ability on the historical performance throughout the degree rather than the unknown performance in the individual assessment itself. So all in all, the comparison of marks illustrate that there's no match between self or peer and towards the lecturer's marking. Students overall seem to be on average more generous than the lecturer. In terms of the students' attitudes towards peer assessment, in this cohort particularly, they really found the use of peer assessment to be a really useful activity which aided their learning, because they know the criteria, what are the things that the lecturers are expecting from them, and then how do the lecturers mark as well. They really find that the peer assessment exercise actually motivated them to learn. Okay, so generally attitudes towards self and peer assessment are rather positive. We did a further study as well. It shows that students felt that their peers actually have the adequate knowledge to assess them, right? And they took a really professional attitude, really serious attitude in terms of when they are doing the peer assessment exercise. This said, however, because it's quite a large group, I think we're talking about 70 plus. So not all students felt the same way towards self and peer assessment. Some students actually expressed their concern or even doubts on their peers' knowledge, whether they have the necessary or appropriate skills or ability to assess their peers. So yeah, that's on self and peer assessment. Secondly, is on another self and peer assessment as well, of public speaking. This is in a communication class where we introduce to them as well using a rubric system. So in this research, we're talking about first year students. So some would have gone through vocational schools, so they would have experiences with rubrics, while others come from sixth form colleges. They would not, it would be their first time using the rubric system. So the aims of this particular research was to investigate the effectiveness, again, the self and peer assessment, as well as to evaluate the impact of rubric assessment on the students' experience of learning in UTB. Okay. So these are some of the findings that we found for this particular study. Similarly, with the work discussed earlier, this study also shared some similar findings. Again, there's a tendency for students to overmark themselves. Again, there's a tendency for students to give their peers higher or lower grades as compared with the lecturer on an average scale. And with the use of rubric, we find that there must be an element of training for the students in order for them to understand its implementation and familiarize themselves with the criteria of the rubric itself. And what are expected from them. So although students in the study felt that the rubric was written in a very clear manner and was easy for them to understand, there were some students who are slightly hesitant as well, which is displayed in the earlier research with the second year students. So yeah, again, it says that when we found out that they think that self-assessment is all right as well, that there's a very positive attitude towards self-assessment, but the students do not feel that they have the skill and ability not just to assess their friends, but even towards themselves when we ask them to do the self-assessment, because they don't think that they have the right knowledge to assess themselves. And that's when I suppose they overmark or even undermark to themselves. Okay, but then they did, surprisingly in this research, they do think that their friends, I think more than half of them actually find that their peers have better knowledge and skills to assess them rather than themselves assessing them. Okay, so we suppose this is could be a result of poor self-confidence amongst the students. So although students found the process of both self and peer assessment a difficult or challenging process, And the cohorts in this, the students cohort, particularly this first year student, they were very positive about the learning benefits of this peer and self assessment exercise. And despite the, well, again, we said that, which is that reflected in the earlier study as well, another concern for self and peer assessment is that students actually express concern, not in terms of the knowledge and skills of their peers, but towards the lack of anonymity in terms of like assessing their peers, even though we have reassured them that their peers will not know who actually marked their paper. They still express the concern towards the anonymity issue there. So they actually were quite hesitant. There were hesitations towards the peer assessment, and some students actually as well show concern that sometimes when it comes to peer assessment, there could be the issue of friendship involved, and then or even biasness in terms of I don't like you, so I'm gonna mark you lower. So these are some of the general concerns towards peer and self-assessment that we found within the students. So yeah, moving on to the next research, which we did as compared to previous intake, where we did the conventional report writing, just purely face-to-face and giving a lecture. So we actually adopted the use of Google Docs as an online collaborative learning platform for the students to actually work on their report. So the aims of this other research on Google Docs is to investigate the students' attitudes and preferences towards the integration of Google Docs on report writing, and to assess the impact of Google Docs on students' collaboration in group work. Again, this is conducted with a group of Year 1 students. Okay, the students, just a bit of background towards this research. The students were actually divided into groups, and they somehow formed 8 groups to work on their report. And then they were asked to choose their mode of communication, whether they prefer face-to-face, where they meet face-to-face at the same time as well. They get to meet their lecturer face-to-face meeting. Okay, as it turned out, well, four groups actually opted. It worked out quite well for us as well, in the sense that 4 groups opted for the face-to-face meeting, while 4 groups actually opted for the Google Docs. Okay, so yeah, prior to the study, we asked the students whether they had any experience in terms of using Google Docs, and 70.5% of the students had experience. Okay, they use it more often as compared to others, whereas others have heard about it but have not really explored the use of Google Docs. So yeah, they're generally using it to discuss assignments such as their reports or presentations back in semester 1. So yeah, this research was conducted in semester 2. Overall, the students enjoyed the experience of using Google Docs to discuss their group assignments, and they were generally very, very positive on the use of Google Docs before and after the writing assignment, despite some students reportedly having not used Google Docs before. So even though those who have not used Google Docs before actually prefer to use Google Docs after they were exposed to the use of it. And students were very in favor of using Google Docs because of its convenience and the real-time features, in the sense that it enables them to view comments and suggestions posted by the lecturer as well as by their peers in the group. And this is very interesting because it's over a course of the report was given in week 1 itself, and they have to submit by, I think, week 10 or 11. The face-to-face group who actually opted for face-to-face group, the students who actually opted for face-to-face group at the initial stage of the research, eventually switched to Google Docs by week 7 itself, because they were having issues which I'll mention later. Okay, and the students would like to use as well Google Docs for similar tasks in the future. They are saying that other lecturers should follow a similar style as well. And this applies as well to the group that opted for face-to-face group face-to-face meeting initially. Okay. So students' attitudes towards the Google Docs, these are some of the advantages and disadvantages of Google Docs that we gather from the students. So the positive thoughts about Google Docs are they really appreciate the accessibility and practicality of Google Docs because it is communication between the group members and the fact that they can edit their document instantaneously. And Google Docs also allow better facilitation and monitoring of work progress, so who has done what. So as the lecturer as well, we can actually monitor who has really done a lot of work as compared to other group members who might not have contributed as much. The disadvantages include technical difficulties such as the data intermittently were found missing from the screen. Because there were lack of communication, I suppose lack of communication between amongst the members. So they find that, hold on, where was the paragraph that I was typing and suddenly it was gone. Or sometimes they felt that they have typed, but then the internet connection just went off. So which brings us to the second disadvantage where they said that there's another issue that's faced by students is the fact that they have a very big or no internet connection for some of the group members. And then the mastering of the Google Doc interface. Some students actually struggle to understand how it works. Of course, that took a bit of like training, but eventually they figure out what is just another Word document but presented as an online platform. So yeah, that was one of the first discovery towards the disadvantage of Google Docs. Furthermore, the reasons why the face-to-face group eventually switched to Google Docs is the fact that they want to engage with the lecturer more because with the Google Docs, Google Doc, they find that the Google Docs group actually have like off-office hour with the lecturer. So sometimes the lecturer will be checking their work, let's say after office hour. So this is something that is lacking with the face-to-face group that only have from 8 to 4:30 to make appointments with the lecturer to discuss their work with them. And that's one of the major reasons why they decide to change to Google Docs, is because they can really talk to the lecturer more and interact with them and get more feedback. And at the same time as well, there were timetable conflicts with the students. So there were instances where the lecturer is free and they were not because they have like issues with their classes. They have to go for their classes and whatnot. And yeah, the findings highlight that it was almost impossible to justify and manage the segregation of both approaches, be it Google Doc or even the face-to-face approach to students from a pedagogical perspective. Neither of the approaches was perfect in isolation, because even with the use of Google Docs, sometimes the students or the groups requested to meet the lecturer face-to-face because they appreciate the, I suppose, the physical interaction with the lecturer in terms of like identifying the tone that's being used and observing the body language as well. So instead, we think that a sensible application of both in a blended manner is likely to best serve the students' learning. So in this context particularly, the use of Google Docs can help to overcome critical communication barriers such as timetable or geographical limitations, because some students will be staying in different districts. So yeah, so Google Docs can help to overcome that. And whilst acting as a motivational platform for sort of like indirect peer-to-peer learning as well, so they can help to learn from each other. However, for complex or ambiguous problems, the use of face-to-face communication is still required. So Google Docs cannot 100% replace face-to-face. Okay, because sometimes there is a requirement to ensure that accurate students' understanding of the feedback is necessary, and depending on the nature of the assignment or the module or subject involved as well, I suppose. Okay, After the use of Google Doc, we experiment as well. We did another experiment in terms of like using flipped classroom. We introduced the implementation of flipped classroom to the class. Okay, the study actually aims to investigate the effectiveness of flipped teaching, evaluate the impact of gender and culture through a flipped classroom, and explore students' changing perceptions of the technique as they gain experience with it. So the purpose of
sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, we have like more or less 2 minutes more. Okay,
right.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll be very quick and share the major findings. So we actually did a flipped classroom questionnaire, and we found that both genders were very neutral towards preference for learning. They generally doesn't really prefer whether it's online or it is face-to-face, although there's a bias towards studying alone and working independently. And in comparison to the male, the female has a better preference towards using technology. So the male basically prefer face-to-face interaction with the lecturer more. So after the implementation of flipped classroom, we find that students, it's their first time learning about flipped classroom as well, or trying it out, and they were generally very positive towards it. And although the motivation eventually decreased over time, the female is found to be so much more lower. Female's motivation is found to be so much lower than the male. And eventually, because they did like 3 flipped classroom exercises over the course of 14 weeks, students did not actually want flipped classroom to be implemented elsewhere, because they don't think that any other subjects, because they were studying mathematics and economics, they don't think that flipped classroom would be suitable in that context. Of course, there are differences in the ways that male and females experience and perception, as shown, and students' perception to flipped classroom change as they develop their experiences with it. So yeah, some actually wanted it, some actually don't like it. I will skip through this. We did as when COVID strikes, when everything has to change to online, we did an online study as well. We did a study on that. And so what we found was that lecturers can adapt to the situation really quickly, and then we eventually from no online to basically 100% online. And the students actually find that the online lessons were useful, and all the contents presented in the communication classes were all presented logically and systematically. Although majority of the students still prefer face-to-face teaching and learning because of the interaction, physical interactions with the lecturers. And of course, distractions are sometimes inevitable. So distractions could be, and technical issues such as poor network connection. Distraction is more towards their family members, where the family members do not know that the students are actually having classes in the room. They will come knocking and say, lunch is ready. Do you want Milo or something like that? So distraction is inevitable. It is always there because it's online learning and they are doing it from home. So yeah, with all these different research that we have done, majority of the students are very adaptable. They are in favor of all the various pedagogical approaches that we have tried, despite them being different cohorts. Okay, all the students actually like the implementation of new pedagogical approach. Of course, as presented in some of the research that I've discussed, challenges are always there. External context, especially technicalities issues when it comes to online, and the students' personality, whether they have a desire to learn or whether they want to participate in the implementation of the new pedagogical approach, is another matter to consider with all this new implementation. And that's it for my talk. I hope I didn't go overboard.
No, you did very well. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee Kok Yueh from University Technology Brunei, for the sharing. I mean, there's lots of findings that you have shared with us on the perceptions of the students with regards to the changes in pedagogy, right? So, well, it's nice to hear that the students like to engage outside classroom hour with the teachers. Well, I'm not sure, is it true for teachers as well? Well, no. Well, I'm sorry. Well, it's a good sign. You know, it's a good sign. We need to say the teaching and learning process goes really well, right? And the kids or the students, they really enjoy the time with the teacher. Yeah. Okay, so a very quick question for you, Dr. Lee, from your experience in having or you know, handling peer introducing peer assessment to the students. Is there any issues of integrity?
Yeah, I suppose it's been voiced out by the students in the sense that the doubts and the concerns that they always share. Despite it being like different cohorts, they always share the same concerns and doubts, and even like some of them were very hesitant in terms of participating in the peer assessment. So our group have no perfect solution in terms of like dealing with that yet. So it's always a challenge with peer assessment in terms of the integrity. So yeah, I have no clear solution to that yet. But eventually I think we'll come up with a solution, hopefully.
Right. Okay, so thank you so much. You know, colleagues, peers, right? I mean, there are some prejudice, biasness, you know, things like that. Well, that is normal. It happens not only to the peers, but also the classroom teachers, you know. So, but I'm sure there'll be ways. I mean, all the best to University Technology Brunei. You know, I think this is a very good effort, you know, introducing peer assessment, having, giving the students more liberty and introducing, you know, adaptive teaching and learning techniques, you know, pedagogy to high learning institutions. All right. So Dr. Lee, I think that's about time. That's about all time that we have. We really enjoy your presentation just now and hope to see you again.